2023 might have had a strong list of contenders for the best games of the year, but it's also played host to a lot of truly terrible releases too. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are the 10 worst video games of 2023. Number 10, Redfall. The Xbox and Bethesda both really needed a win this year, and thank goodness they had Starfield. Redfall was one of the many games continuing the greater conversation about games launching in unfinished states, and it was one of the most prominent for a few reasons. For one, it was coming from beloved studio Arcane, and yet was plagued with all manner of performance issues on launch to the point where it became the laughingstock of the industry. Additionally, it was positioned as a tentpole title for Game Pass this year and wasn't even worth that month's charge, let alone a standalone purchase price. Even aside from enemies ignoring physics and collision detection, frame rate issues, and crashes, the game was also just dull. It featured underwhelming mission structures, a lack of truly original features, and a bad multiplayer setup where progression was tied to a party's host, meaning you'd have to start all over again if playing by yourself or with a different group of friends. But Bethesda have said they're committed to making it a good game over time, but for whom to enjoy? The looter-shooter genre is oversaturated and tired, so it's not surprising that the PC version of Redfall had a steep drop-off in player count and has remained at less than 100 ever since. Number 9, Quantum Error. Quantum Error should be praised for trying some relatively new things, and unlike a lot of games on the system, it does try to use the PlayStation 5's DualSense controller in interesting ways. Playing as a firefighter on board a futuristic space station, you'll need to pay attention to the haptic feedback coming off a door to see if opening it would cause a backdraft. There's a moment where you use the microphone on the controller to perform CPR. Unfortunately, these sound more interesting than they are enjoyable to perform. The game suffers with the standard sci-fi issue of repeating steel corridors, and coupled with unclear maps and very few chances to save, it can make navigating a chore. Enemies don't present a huge threat, as their AI either defaults to just running at you or standing around oblivious, not taking cover. That said, the biggest enemy standing in your way is performance issues, soft locks, and crashes that will halt and greatly reset your progress. Despite some of its more unique additions to the formula, releasing in a year that is this stacked for horror, and in the shadow of the Dead Space remake, which this game so clearly apes, Quantum Error threw itself out of the airlock. Number 8, Everybody Won to Switch. If asked about the lineup of Nintendo Switch launch games, almost everybody would probably say Breath of the Wild, and then spend some time racking their brains trying to remember any of the others. Another first-party developed title was One to Switch, a spiritual successor of sorts to the likes of Wii Play and Nintendo Land, designed to be a good demonstration of the console's gimmicks. You've forgotten about it because it wasn't very interesting. However, even though it's less than 6 months old, its sequel is just as forgettable. In fact, it can be assumed that Nintendo felt obligated to release Everybody Won to Switch, after reportedly producing physical cases and then discovering it had tested poorly. After some tweaking, it launched to almost no response at all. The Jackbox Party Pack-inspired integration of mobile phones to grow the number of potential players was a good concept, but Everybody Won to Switch is just kind of worthless without a large group. Also, the minigames it features are painfully simple. Relay races, bingo, and the kind of stuff that should comprise a greater whole, like Mario Party minigames, but without the greater whole. Releasing late into the lifespan of the console, and in a year with new entries in some of Nintendo's biggest franchises, Everybody Won to Switch was not a smouldering wreck, just kind of pointless. Number 7, Testament: The Order of High Human. First-person fantasy adventures will inevitably draw comparisons to Skyrim, but it's very clear that's sort of what Testament: The Order of High Human always wanted. Aim for the moon and you'll land upon the stars, they say, conveniently forgetting that it's not all that easy to breathe in outer space. And sadly, Testament becomes a fairly suffocating experience very quickly. At first glance, it's quite a pretty little fantasy adventure. Initial story intrigue grinds to a halt amongst overlong cutscenes. The promise of Metroidvania-style dungeons at the off falls apart pretty quickly. Still, there's certainly always room on the market for a chunky, responsive, combat-focused fantasy romp. It's a shame then that Testament's combat, which makes up the bulk of the game, is so horrendous. The game is arena after arena after arena of battles against waves of enemies, despite the combat feeling like it was designed for one-on-one battles. You will take damage from all around you as you wail repeatedly with your sword, fire off a few arrows at enemies out of reach, and occasionally blast some pretty basic magic spells, assuming your casting isn't interrupted. Repeat ad nauseum. It's about as deep as pond water, and much like pond water, fun to splash around in for a little while before you realise it doesn't have anything new to show you in its 14th hour compared to its first. Number 6, Crime Boss: Rockay City. Sometimes when you look at a game, it's not hard to see where most of its budget went. In the case of crime boss Rocky City, it was its casting. The game itself should function as a kitsch and nostalgic nod back to early 90s cop and action movies, especially considering it stars Michael Madsen, Danny Trejo, Kim Basinger, Vanilla Ice, and many more. However, the novelty wears very thin considering the cast almost completely fails to put in a satisfying performance. And Chuck Norris as the sheriff of Rocky City in particular is just painfully phoned in. The game itself is equally as disappointing as the presentation. It's a roguelite heist simulator which just so happens to be bogged down by poor balance. Enemies are spongy, the option for stealth feels tacked on, and the various game modes are all pretty damn similar. There's nothing in here you haven't seen elsewhere. In fact, it's hard not to spend most of the time playing Crime Boss thinking about how much more fun you'd be having if you were playing the now decade-old Payday 2. Heck, Payday 3 was released this year to mixed reviews, and it still at least has more charm than the surface-deep Rocky City. Number 5, Grey Hill Incident. Just because a game is basic doesn't mean it's bad. However, there's a fine line. Something that's too simple can feel positively unfinished. Enter Grey Hill Incident, an alien invasion-themed horror title from the nascent Refugium Games. Grey Hill Incident largely consists of the player skulking around the titular town under the cover of darkness, which, to be fair to it, is its strongest suit. The game looks okay for a small indie dev, and it initially generates an intriguing atmosphere, despite some pretty ghastly dialogue. However, navigating Grey Hill is hard because of how pitch black it is, and the torch you're given is no respite, as it seems to immediately alert the extraterrestrial threats, who, it should be noted, are faster than you are. So it's impossible to run from them, it's hard to hide from them, and it's not much fun to fight them considering how slow your character moves and how little ammunition there is to be had. Add to this that the game never really tells you where to go, and you're in for a pretty miserable time. Grey Hill Incident isn't even that long, but it's longer than necessary because it simply seems to set you up to fail every step of the way. Any potential this game had feels squandered very quickly. Number 4, Silent Hill Ascension. 8 years after the official cancellation of PT, Konami would always struggle to claw back their fanbase. Very few predicted that they would kick off a new era of Silent Hill with this. Silent Hill Ascension is a quasi-video game and quasi-streaming series developed by a strange combination of Genvid, Bad Robot, and Behaviour Interactive. The general idea is a weekly episode which players watch live and then all vote on certain decisions in order to create the community-decided canon path. That doesn't sound terrible, but the CGI is bad, the characters are boring, it feels like Silent Hill by the numbers, and most importantly of all, it's monetized to the teeth. Players are immediately greeted upon opening the app with a splash screen offering the $20 Founders Pack, which contains cosmetic pieces for your time spent in the live chat and influence points. These can be used to swing the vote in Ascension's weekly episodes to determine the path the story will take. So it's a free-to-play show where you can spend money to influence it, and if you have the most money, in fact, you not only get the most say, but you can be rewarded for it. Silent Hill deserves so much better than this shallow, brazenly greedy use of the IP. Number 3, The Lord of the Rings, Gollum. Something about Gollum's video game debut screamed disaster from the beginning. Being developed by Daedalic Entertainment, who had never been handed a big product like The Lord of the Rings before, and published by Nacon, who, despite a roster of teams working under them, have never released anything notable outside of the Rally franchise WRC, set this up for failure from the beginning. As a concept, playing as the runt of Middle-earth wasn't inherently flawed, but the result was comprised entirely of flaws. Gollum's May release made it the talk of the internet as one of the year's biggest lows. It was buggy, boring, and shallow to play, controlled horribly, and was ugly as sin. Smeagol himself looked significantly worse in the final game compared to marketing footage. This barely functional mess deserved to be pointed and laughed at, especially when it asked players for $60 at launch and then $10 more for a DLC that simply made Elvish characters speak their native tongue. It wasn't surprising to learn that development of the game had been extremely troubled after the 2 years of delays that had hit it. Despite the poor reception and Daedalic reportedly moving to focus more on publishing than developing, there is apparently still a Switch port to come. Cast it into the fires of Mount Doom and never look back. Number 2, Stray Souls. If you're not a fan of Bloober Team's fairly on-the-nose horror, then Stray Souls makes Layers of Fear and The Medium look like masterpieces by comparison. Jukai Studios' Stray Souls is a loud and pompous attempt at a survival horror game where absolutely nothing works as intended. The main character's facial animations are almost as comical as the forced jump scares. The combat is janky when it works at all and doesn't randomly stop you you from aiming your weapon. The story is almost non-existent and tied together with tired tropes and puzzles. At least with Stray Souls, you aren't wasting as much money as, say, on Gollum, as the game is available for a mere $30. But that's not helped by the fact that Stray Souls has the absolute full hand of terrible. Not only is it a bad game, it's made by awful people. Artur Lukowski, the game's lead, left social media after people discovered his Twitter likes were full of transphobic and racist bile. If hate isn't enough for you, he's also a hack. Stray Soul uses AI art and asset flips from the Unreal Engine store, and even with this assistance, it still blows. All this in a game that happens to be scored by legendary Silent Hill composer Akira Yamaoka, whose soundtrack, unsurprisingly, is about the only redeeming quality of this dumpster fire. And number 1, Skull Island: Rise of Kong. 2023 has not just been a year of bad games, but broken and unfinished, horrible, flaming carcasses. And we thought we'd seen it all by October, but then Skull Island: Rise of Kong rocked up to take the crown. Perhaps the most infamous moment of the game went briefly viral because of just how unbelievable it was. A poorly designed Kong smashes untextured rocks in a fit of rage after recalling a memory of a dinosaur captured as a PNG image flashing up on the screen. It wasn't surprising to learn that Iguana B had gone through poor working conditions and been kept to an impossible deadline of a single year when developing Skull Island. The game should be judged on its performance issues like clipping geometry, poor texture loaded, and animations and camera control that are totally at odds with each other. But because of publisher Game Mill being so set on cranking the title out ASAP, even if it ran smoothly, it would still be an abomination. The game is made up of totally barren, boring levels, populated by enemies with completely mindless AI, and the combat is an absolute disaster. Game Mill knew this and simply didn't care. It's hard to call this the worst game of the year, as it's much closer to an outright scam. But all the same, Con takes the throne for stinkiest turd of 2023. I mean, surely nothing's as bad as this. It would take another Game Mill disaster to top it. Oh god, not again. No, no, no!